Verse 16 of Philemon says, "No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother." What does Paul mean by this 8-clause word in the Greek? No longer a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. Matter of fact, in the Greek, it comes across like Paul is saying, no longer a slave, but better than a slave, a dearly beloved brother. What does Paul mean when he says that Onesimus is no longer a slave, but now is a sibling of Philemon? We talked about in the first session of this series that Philemon as a letter has a controversial, notorious history. Some people look at this letter or they think of Paul and they think this is someone that is for freedom, someone who's advocating for freedom of a slave. Others look at this and they see something else, that this is for slavery advocacy, that Paul is for slavery. And so which is it? What does Paul mean when he says that Onesimus is no longer a slave, but he's more than a slave? He is a beloved brother. Over the last 3 sessions, we haven't been dodging this question, but we also haven't looked at it head on. And that is what this session is actually going to be all about. What does Paul hope that Philemon will do as he sends Onesimus back and says, welcome him no longer as a slave, but now as a brother? Does he mean set Onesimus free? Or does he mean show him sibling love even though he is a slave? The way that we are going to figure this out is by looking at a key cultural concept that is called hospitality. Hospitality in the 21st century United States is very different than hospitality in the first century of Paul. When we think of hospitality today in the United States, we think of businesses like hotels and Airbnb. We think of guest services in hospitals or in stores and in restaurants. We think of organizations that have coordinators in their churches or in their colleges to help guests feel more at home and welcome. And although making a guest feel at home is totally part of hospitality, it was a way bigger deal in the first century. And I think the only way we're truly going to understand this question and be able to figure out the answer to what does Paul hope to happen between Philemon and Onesimus involving Onesimus' bondage is if we understand what hospitality is during Paul's time. And so as we've been doing, we're going to look at the text. We're going to look at the context and the subtext. And we're going to begin with the text by seeing how does Paul talk about hospitality? How does he bring up this cultural concept of hospitality within the letter? We see that there are 3 specific verses where Paul talks about hospitality. The first verse is verse 17. Welcome him as you would welcome me. And he uses this Greek word proslamvano. The word just literally means welcome. But this was used in scenes of hospitality whenever you welcomed in a stranger into your house to take care of them. And so Paul uses this word, welcome him as you would welcome me. Paul also uses another phrase here, etimazo xenia, in verse 22. He says, make sure, by the way, to prepare a guest room for me. That's what he says in verse 22, because I'm hoping to become free through your prayers. A guest room is actually the place where a stranger or a guest would stay at whenever they were visiting on a journey. And so when Paul says, prepare a guest room for me, he immediately brings up a different type of letter that he is writing. This is no longer just an epistle. This is no longer just a prison epistle. It's actually a letter of hospitality, which we actually have a ton of cultural artifacts reserved from the 1st century and 2nd century of people doing this very thing. This is when, if a family member was going on a distant journey into a place they did not know, another family member could write a letter for them and tell them to go to someone that they know's house in that distant land, give the letter to them, and then that would serve kind of as like a vouching slip for them or a recommendation to show hospitality to that person, which means This letter of Philemon, as he sends it with Onesimus to Philemon, is a letter of hospitality. The last Greek term that shows up in this letter that talks about hospitality is this word, aspazome. And he says this in verse 23, when he just says, my fellow prisoner Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ, Epaphras, he greets you. This word for aspazome means just to greet someone. And although they would literally say hey, but in their way they would say here, it meant more than just saying hi. The way that they would greet people in hospitality scenes would normally be clasping of hands, a kissing on the cheek, maybe kissing on the forehead, maybe even the lips, depending on the relationship. But all four of these terms and all three of these verses definitely bring into someone's mind the practice of hospitality. A lot of scholars will say, whenever they read Philemon, nowhere does Paul explicitly say, set Onesimus free. This is true, and it's also kind of wrong. It's true in the sense of, yes, as you read through this letter, you will not find anywhere where Paul says, set Onesimus free. But I believe in using these words and bringing up the cultural idea of hospitality, that even though Paul doesn't say, set Onesimus free, Philemon would understand that Paul means to set Onesimus free. But the only way that we'll be able to truly understand this is by understanding what hospitality was in the first century. And this leads us to the context. There's an amazing book that you should all read called the Iliad. In the Iliad, there is a big war taking place between Troy and the Achaeans. The Achaeans is a bunch of Greeks kind of all coming together to take down Troy. It's an epic story of love and of battle, of pain and of virtue. One of the characters in the Iliad is a guy named Diomedes. Diomedes is a soldier for the Achaeans, and he is a bad dude, okay? As he goes through the battle, he's just wiping people out left and right. All the Trojans are afraid of him. All the Achaeans love him. It even says in the story that he's so strong that he can cause harm onto divine beings if you ever come in contact with one. At one point in the story, he comes in contact with a guy on the Trojan side named Glaucus. And so I need you to imagine this battlefield and the two of these guys on chariots staring one another down, about to attack each other. And Diomedes says to Glaucus, "Who are you so I can know who I'm about to kill?" Pretty bad. Glaucus then actually goes into his family history. He kind of looks up his ancestry.com, right? And he talks about who his grandfather is and who his father is and how his father went on this adventure and he almost died, but he lived through hospitality and now he has great wealth and this is who his family is. After he said this, Diomedes grabs his spear and instead of throwing it at Glaucus, he puts it down on the ground. He then looks at Glaucus and he says, "Well, in that case, you and I are friends. We're friends." After this moment, they hop down off of their chariots. They come to each other. They take off their armor and exchange them. And then they vow, "We will not attack one another during this entire war." What in the world is going on? How do you go from I'm about to kill this dude, and then you hear his story, and you're like, "Nah, hey, we're best friends." And the answer is actually in Diomedes' explanation. He says, "We are friends. Why? Because my father showed your father hospitality once. And that therefore makes us fictive kin." Hospitality was more than just taking care of guests and making them feel at home. It was a transformative practice and process. And so what is the process of hospitality? There are 4 essential steps in it. Of course, you need strangers. This has to involve at least 2 different parties, and it has to involve recognizing, hey, this person doesn't live around here. They need some place to stay. And so you go to them and you greet them, and then you welcome them in. And welcoming them into your house This normally looked like giving them food, water, wine, stuff to be able to bathe in. And then you just talked about your different stories. And matter of fact, it wasn't until like the end, once you actually started eating with one another, that you had to share your identity. You didn't actually have to begin by sharing who you were. Near the end of the hospitality scene, though, there is a moment that doesn't always happen, but where the host could exchange gifts. And so the host could give a gift to the guest, and the guest could reciprocate a gift. In the story of the Iliad, Diomedes makes sure to say not just that his father showed Glaucus' father hospitality, but that they actually exchanged gifts with one another. And this was not something you had to do in hospitality scenes, but you did it if you wanted to grow into a more familial-like relationship. And this led to the final culmination of hospitality, which was a transformation. The two parties went from being strangers to family. Fictive kin was the type of language that they would use. So hospitality is not just about being kind to strangers, making them feel welcome. That actually, at its best, it was about transforming strangers into family. Apparently so strong of a process that it could take people who were literally about to kill one another in this fictional story of the Iliad and transform them into friends. And so as we get back into the text of Philemon, and Paul is clearly bringing up hospitality language and code, the question is, does Paul also talk about this 4-step process of hospitality? And the answer is, he does. And if he does, this helps answer the question of, does Paul want Philemon to set Onesimus free? But we first have to get into the subtext to figure out how clear this is. So, are there strangers within Philemon, in this letter of Philemon? There most certainly is. You have to remember that in the first session, we talked about that ultimately Paul he desires for Philemon to mirror Christ. And in Colossians, Paul describes what Christ has done, that he has reconciled all the world, including people like Gentiles who are estranged. They are strangers to the covenant of God, and yet they have been reconciled too. And that Philemon is just supposed to do the same thing with the strangers and estranged around him, being Onesimus. And so, in the fact that they are estranged, Philemon and Onesimus are strangers to one another. So we get to the second one. Is there welcoming in the text? Well, clear as day, there is in multiple verses this idea that Philemon needs to show hospitality in welcoming Onesimus. Welcome Onesimus as you would welcome me. But now we get to this third step. Is there an exchange of gifts? And I believe there is. And there are two ways that we can see this within the text. The first way is harking back to what we talked about in session 1. And then verse 6, Paul tells Philemon that he hopes through the sharing of his faith. And we talked about, what does it mean to share faith? And it's this idea of being in a mutual relationship with someone where you each seek each other's well-being. It's this idea of taking a good and giving it to a person so that they will be better off. And it's a mutual, it just keeps on going back and forth, this circular rotation of exchanging this good. So the question is, what is this good that they are supposed to be circulating? And the good is grace. Grace, as we think about it today, means unmerited favor, but the word literally means a gift, something that you did not earn, something that you do not necessarily deserve. And so as Paul talks about Philemon's relationship with Onesimus, he is saying they are to exchange the grace of God with one another. And so we have the exchange of the gift present. Is there transformation? There most certainly is. As we began this session, Paul says that Onesimus is no longer a slave, but he is better than a slave. He is more than a slave. He is now a beloved brother. He is now a beloved sibling in Christ. In the Iliad, hospitality is a practice that can take fictional characters who are enemies to one another, literal threats to one another, and make them friends. But in this historical letter by Paul, he utilizes the same cultural concept of hospitality to demonstrate how two people who are estranged from one another, who see each other as threats due to the fear that has built up, and says through the exchange of this gift of God's grace, they are transformed, not from being any longer slave and master, but now to being brothers and sisters in Christ. So the question is, did Paul want Onesimus to be freed from his bondage? I would like to put it to us in this way as an equation. Paul says that Onesimus is now a brother. So Onesimus equals brother. He said, as we talked about in the last session, that reconciliation has to be not just spiritual, but physical. And as we talked about in this session, hospitality is transformative. When you add these things up together, Paul is expecting for Philemon to do something that is physical, that is transformative, and that demonstrates that he and Onesimus are siblings. And so I leave you with this question as we ask, did Paul expect for Philemon to set Onesimus free? The answer is clearly yes. For how else can you physically display this transformation of someone going from being enslaved to being a sibling beyond just saying, I will take off and remove your chains and your bondage?